Hey there, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business. And in this particular video, we continue our exploration of Chapter 1 content from our textbook as we talk about markets, how markets work, and we mentioned something in the last video about perfect competition in a marketplace. Competition is really the driving force behind supply and demand, as we'll see in this video as we begin to look at the topic of competition in markets. Now, we've talked a little bit about the basics of how a market is supposed to work in terms of supply and demand. And we'll note in this video that the kinds of things we talk about in a simple supply and demand situation work best in what we call a perfectly competitive marketplace. Now, we'll talk a little bit about what makes a perfectly competitive marketplace to illustrate how those kinds of mechanisms work, and then we'll discuss in the real world what really happens in marketplaces in terms of competition. And as a result, what are opportunities to earn profit for a business? So let's start out by talking about the topic of competition in a market economy with regards to private enterprise. Remember that as opposed to a planned economy, in a market economy, as you see here, we have the private enterprise system, which is a system that allows individuals to pursue their own interests with minimal government restrictions. In other words, you don't have a centralized government planning industry saying, no matter what you want to do with your life, you will be a farmer. Don't care if you're interested in mathematics, if you're interested in accounting, if you're interested in marketing, you're going to be a farmer because we have decided as the centralized planning industry, that's where we want to place you in terms of using your labor. Rather than that, in a private enterprise system, it allows individuals to pursue their own interests, their own ambitions, their own passions, their own gifts and talents, their own curiosity, with minimal government restriction and minimal government planning. That's sort of the linchpin upon which the private enterprise system really functions. And so in a private enterprise system requires really four things to work well. And you see them listed here on this slide. First of all, private enterprise requires private property rights to be respected. In other words, ownership of the resources used to create wealth is in the hands of the individual. It's not owned by the state. It's not owned by the government. It's possible to own it by individual means. And that, of course, flows into number two, freedom of choice. You can sell your labor to any employer you choose. In fact, you can sell what you own to anyone who is willing to buy. So it's not just your labor, but of course also if you own private property, you are free to use it and to consume it and to sell it to anyone that you choose as long as you're doing it legally. Number three, profits. The lure of profits leads some people to abandon the security of working for somebody else and assume the risks of entrepreneurship because of your interests, your passions, and the possibility, the attraction of earning profit. You may decide, I've worked here at Starbucks Coffee long enough. I'm going to open my own coffee shop. I've worked at this automotive repair shop long enough. I'm going to open my own automotive repair shop, etc., etc. That's what you see as the mechanism of the lure of profits, leading some people to take on the risks of entrepreneurship and start something on their own. And finally, private enterprise requires number four, competition. Competition is what occurs when two or more businesses are vying or competing for the same resources or customers. In other words, it is a long-standing principle in the market economy that when you have two or more firms in the same industry competing for market share, that the consumer really is the one who wins. Because typically what the consumer receives is greater choice, more options, eventually lower prices and higher quality. All of those things are wins when you have healthy competition in a marketplace. So you see here the 4 things that private enterprise requires to function well. Now, in the real world, what ends up happening is while we begin our discussion in economics talking about perfect competition, there really are different degrees of competition depending upon the industry, depending upon the market. This particular table is reproduced from your textbook. You can study it further there, but we essentially try to give you 4 different industries or markets to give you examples of different degrees of competition. So you can see here in the second column, in the example of perfect competition, let's say selling navel oranges. Oranges you're growing in large crops, and there's several, perhaps tens or perhaps more than 50 different farmers all selling identical navel oranges into the orange marketplace. In that particular case, you see what happens. There's a number of competitors. The ease of entry into the industry is relatively easy. The goods themselves are all identical, and the level of price control that individual firms have over the marketplace, well, they don't have any. And so in that particular situation, when you have many of identical products being offered to the buyer, then the buyer and the seller end up using simple supply and demand to determine the equilibrium price and quantity to bring in the marketplace. Now, that's relatively simple to understand in concept. But if you go to the next column, what we call monopolistic competition, things get a little more complicated. Now, I want to say right at the outset, you notice the term is monopolistic competition, not monopoly. We're not talking about a monopoly in this column. We're talking about monopolistic competition. An example given to you is, of course, the commercial marketplace for breakfast cereal. Most of us grew up eating breakfast cereal at one point in time as a kid or not, and you all have your favorites, right? If I asked you right now to raise your hand, what's your favorite breakfast cereal? Some of you would raise your hand for Captain Crunch. Some of you say, well, perhaps Cocoa Krispies or Cocoa Puffs, or you'll just plain old Cheerios or Grape Nuts. There's just lots of different choices. But remember, the choices are not infinite. The number of competitors is many, but fewer than in perfect competition. The ease of entry into the industry is fairly easy, and the goods are similar, but they're not identical. In fact, some of you would argue they're not similar at all. I can't live without Captain Crunch, but don't you dare try and sneak Cocoa Krispies into my bowl, etc., right? We have differentiation, and we have preferences. And therefore, because there's a little bit of difference from one brand of breakfast cereal to another, firms can exercise some degree of price control. Now, let's compare that to the situation one column over in the oligopoly. The oligopoly is when you have a few competitors, much less than in monopolistic competition, but certainly not a monopoly. So, for instance, in gaming consoles, what are our choices? Well, you know what they are, right? There is Xbox, there is PlayStation, and then, of course, there is Nintendo Switch. Right? Ease of entry into the industry is difficult. The goods are similar in some ways, but very different in others, right? And therefore, there is a degree of price control by individual firms. When you move finally over to monopoly, the instance of, for instance, there's only one utility company in the Bay Area, that's PG&E, right? Public utility, there are no competitors. It's completely the ease of entry into the industry. Well, the entry into the industry in this particular case is regulated by the government. There are no competition. Therefore, the monopoly itself exercises a considerable degree of price control. Let's look at these one by one. In perfect competition, you see what is necessary. Number one, the products of each firm are so similar, like in navel oranges, buyers view them as identical, right? There's no real differentiation between seller A and seller B's goods. Both the buyers and the sellers know the prices that others are paying and receiving in the marketplace, and because each firm is small, it's easy for firms to enter or leave the market. Going prices are set exclusively by supply and demand and accepted by both sellers and buyers. And in this particular case then, in the case of perfect competition, all firms earn normal economic profit. There really is no opportunity to earn anything other than what we would call normal economic profit, which simply means they earn a small degree of profit, but nothing more than that. Contrast that next with monopolistic competition, a market characterized by numerous buyers and relatively numerous sellers who are trying to differentiate their products from those of the competitors. You see some example industries there, not only breakfast cereal, but automobiles. The result is, because there's a little bit of differentiation between products, there is the opportunity, not the promise, but simply the opportunity to earn slightly higher than normal economic profit. There's competition, people switch all the time, but there is from time to time the opportunity to earn slightly higher than normal economic profit. We keep moving on to the oligopoly, a market characterized by a handful of sellers, a small number who have generally large players with the power to influence the prices of their products. And you see some examples in video gaming consoles, right? And as a result, opportunities to earn higher than normal economic profit. Significantly higher than normal economic profit. Those, again, are simply opportunities. They're not guaranteed, but many times folks will make a healthy amount of return on their invested capital because they're in an oligopoly situation. And finally, when you get to the monopoly, which we define as a market or industry in which there's really only one producer, and therefore that producer can set whatever price they can get away with in the marketplace because there is no competition and there are no options. As a result, you see there at the bottom, there is significant opportunity to earn much higher than normal economic profit and to defend it over an extended period of time. You see some examples there, not only public utilities like PG&E, but also, for instance, how many companies make the Windows operating system for computers? Well, just one, Microsoft, right? Or in search engines, right? How many people use something other than Google worldwide? Yes, Google has essentially something very close to a complete natural monopoly on internet search, and therefore a significant opportunity to earn much higher than normal economic profit over an extended period of time. What does this mean to us today? It means if you are a seller, a producer, what you're looking for is an opportunity to earn as much economic profit as possible and to defend it over a long period of time. In other words, the most attractive market situation for you is the monopoly, or is getting as close to a monopoly as possible in the real world. However, as a consumer, as a buyer, the most advantageous market situation for you is something with lots of options, with free information, something as close as possible in the real world to perfect competition. And therefore you see the tension there, right? What's good for sellers, what's good for buyers or consumers, and therefore the differences in opportunities that each type of marketplace represents simply because of the type and level of competition and results for both the buyer and the seller out of those kinds of sustained situations in the marketplace. So it isn't simply what is a government's choice of economic system. It is also, to the degree that you have market economy characteristics in certain industries, and in those market situations, what type of competitive environment do you have, that will have a great impact on the consequences, not only to industry and producers and sellers, but also to buyers and consumers like you and I. This is the nature of how business works when we ask the question, well, what is business? Understanding economic systems, understanding how a market economy works, and understanding the characteristics of competition in marketplaces. I hope that's helpful to you. We'll see you in the next lecture.